I'm Dr. Thomas Wayment, and you're listening to Gospel Tangents.
It's the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to have Dr. Thomas Wayment back on the show. He's come out with a new edition of the New Testament and has been able to add some more footnotes. We'll talk about the controversy his first book had on the Joseph Smith translation and see if that's continuing, if there's any fallout from that. So you won't want to miss this conversation with Tom. Check it out.
Welcome to Gospel Tangents. I'm excited to have my favorite classics professor at BYU. Could you go ahead and tell us who you are and where we are?
Yeah, I'm Dr. Thomas Wayment, and you're here with me in my office at BYU, and I teach classics, which means Greek and Latin primarily, and sometimes Greek New Testament as well.
Okay, very good. Now, Margaret Toscano is also a classics teacher at the University of Utah. Do you interact with her very often?
I know her work. I on a personal level, no, but I'm very well aware of her work. And,
okay.
Yeah, great work.
You don't talk Greek and Latin to each other?
Yeah, you would think with such a small community we would, but our interests are a little different. I work in a different period of time than she does.
Oh,
yeah.
What's your focus mainly?
Mostly what I'm working on nowadays is the everyday lives of people in the first, second, and third centuries. So I'm really interested in the people that aren't told in the big stories, that don't appear, the people that don't write the stories, if you will, these people behind the scenes that are being described. And so I look at papyri and other types of things that really are interesting and ask, hey, what was everyday life like back then?
And Margaret, is she more focused on women?
Yeah, she does a lot more work on women and with a fascinating work as well. And in my work, there are papyri written by women, and there's been quite a bit of work done on them. But I'm interested in what we might call plebeian or non-elites and what they do and how they live their lives.
So do you get into the martyrs at all, like Perpetua and some of those?
It's there. It's there. And their books are, although not good Greek, are considered high literature. These are written with intent and reasons for writing. They're telling another story, a meta story, even though they're telling the story of a martyrdom. And so I tend to shy away from them, but yeah, I definitely have worked with them.
Okay, very good. Well, the reason why we're back on the show is you've got why don't you grab a copy there, your second edition of the New Testament. Why don't you go ahead and show it to the camera? Okay, very good. And why do you have a second edition?
It's a bit of a kind of journey story, but due to some publisher decisions here on campus, they decided that they for whatever reasons could no longer market it and sell it. And
it doesn't have the word Mormon in it.
It doesn't, no. And I think it is associated with a larger decision somewhere up the road that I know nothing about that really said that I think, and I hope I don't mischaracterize this, that the church was kind of worried maybe about a commercialization of Scripture with diaries and other types of scriptural products. And I think there was a narrowing of that space in my book, which I think wasn't targeted. They said, we're really going to go back to the 2013 scriptures. We're going to print those, and that's really it. And so this was good for me. I don't want to come across as complaining. It gave me a chance to say, hey, there's some footnotes I want to adjust. I would like to redo the intro. I'd like to add some appendix material. And a lot of reviewers said, hey, we want you to be more transparent with what you did with the JST. And so this gave me a chance, and Koford has been great to work with. They were absolutely wonderful. And so here's the new edition.
So, yeah, that's exactly where I wanted to go, because I know your previous work with Adam Clarke and that sort of thing in the Joseph Smith translation, that was kind of a big deal.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you saying that.
Kind of controversial, I guess, too.
Yeah, for some. And it's unfortunate because the work has been both mischaracterized and it's been attacked for reasons that I think are completely unfair. And so it's hard to say this to an audience, a Latter-day Saint audience, and help them hear what I feel. So here I am as a scholar. I have access to the same Greek that everyone else does. We don't have lost Greek manuscripts, if you will, that are only a small group knows about. We really all accept the Greek text with a kind of known set of variants. And as a scholar, the JST is not derivable from that. You can't look at the Greek and get to the JST in 99.9% of the instances. There's a few places where the pronouns follow a different manuscript tradition. And so as a scholar, you have to ask yourself, where does the JST come from? What is this? And I think for a long time, after Bob Matthews' work, there's this idea that maybe some of it is a restoration of original, but even for him, that was maybe not what it was. And then other scholars who've worked have said, hey, yeah, there's maybe some original, but this is other things. And people will use words like midrash or commentary. And the interesting thing is when I suggested, hey, maybe it's influenced by 19th century sources, that got a lot of people kind of, whoa, well, maybe we didn't mean those sources or something like that.
Okay. And so, I mean, it's really interesting because I think last time we talked a little bit about different versions of the Bible. And I have to tell you, I remember asking you specifically what you thought was a good, and I think you said ESV.
Yeah, I like the ESV.
Well, one of my listeners in Arkansas sent me an ESV Bible after listening. So I got a Bible out of it.
Oh, fantastic. No, that's a great translation.
So thank you, Willie. And so, I mean, because it is one of those struggles. It kind of relates to the Book of Mormon. Is the Book of Mormon a translation or is it a revelation? And so the Joseph Smith translation, I mean, we use the word translation, and I think the implication is, well, there were lost parts and Joseph Smith is restoring that. But when you go back to these original Greek and Latin, that's not really what happened, right?
It's not there. We don't have any evidence for that, especially, these bigger changes that he adds to the Bible. And then the other thing that's really challenging is there are things like forged verses in the Bible. So 1 John, the epistle 5:7, that's a known forgery. That's not a question that any of us have.
Is that the Trinity forgery?
Yeah.
We talked about that last time.
The Johannine comma. And so he leaves that in. And that becomes problematic. In Gospel of Mark, our manuscripts end at chapter 16, verse 8, but he leaves 9 through 20 in. And so you have to ask yourself, in a fair way, and not to be critical of it, to say, what is this thing? It's really not giving us the best manuscript tradition. It's giving us something else. And I think the problem, what was so hard for people to hear from me, is that the work was initially characterized as me claiming that Joseph plagiarized. And I don't believe that in him for a minute. I don't think he sits down with a book and kind of creates the JST from it. But I think other people are talking about the Bible the same way he does in his day. They are changing order of verses. They're adding this word here to clarify. And those things are appearing in his translation of the Bible.
Is translation the right word? Should we be using another word?
Maybe.
I mean, I know midrash has been thrown around. I don't know if that's a perfect word either.
It's not. I don't think any of these words are the ideal words because he's not sitting down with Greek and creating English. This is English to English, so a conversion might be a way.
The Joseph Smith conversion?
Yeah. And
okay.
In a sense, this translation, means to bear a crossed meaning, if you will. That's the idea of a translation. And to us, it really means, Greek to English or something like that. And I think what he's doing, why he would refer to it as such, or why other people would, is the idea that he's taken the meaning of the printed text and told us what he thought it means through inspiration, through revelation, although even those words are hard to know which one he would characterize it as.
Okay.
I could easily see him later saying, I would have done that verse differently had I, known what I know now, kind of thing. Like if you were working on it in, say, 1843 or 44 rather than earlier. So it's my sense that it's ever-changing for him. He gives late sermons where he comments on the Bible in ways that are different than the JST that he did in 1831.
Well, and I know you're a New Testament scholar. One of the frustrations for me, I guess, as we look at D&C 132, it says that regarding polygamy, that God commanded Abraham to practice polygamy. But when you go to Genesis, that's not what happened. It's his wife, Sarah, saying, hey, why don't you take Hagar? I can't get pregnant, obviously, but maybe Hagar can. where's God in that equation?
Yeah, right. That creates an interesting conversation. And I suppose I have some of that feeling too, being able to read the Greek behind the New Testament. It's really hard to understand how you get to the JST. Like, what is it doing? And it's to me, and it's me only, I don't feel like he's engaging the Greek. I think he's engaging the English, and I think he's part of his day. I think he's being influenced by things he's read, heard, thought about, prayed about, and it's influenced his view of the Bible.
So maybe we could call it the Joseph Smith commentary on the Bible. Would that be a good way to talk about it?
It works. I mean, it works in so many ways. The challenge is, and when you mention your challenges, for someone like me, there's this question to me, if the Bible is subject to correction today and not by manuscripts, how does someone like myself engage that? Is the Bible stable for Latter-day Saints? So the Book of Mormon's a fixed text. We don't go back and correct that, but the New Testament isn't that way for Latter-day Saints. And an interesting thing that happened in my Sunday school last Sunday, the teacher read the text and Jesus was saying one thing, and then the Joseph Smith translation changes it to the exact opposite, like taking out a not. And that's interesting for me. How do I grapple with that? Or am I to believe that the Bible was wrong and then that I'm supposed to see it that way? Is Joseph Smith teaching me that he was sensitive to the way it was said and he's saying, I don't see that? And then it all came down to a confusion on the Greek word to try. And so I see it in all three of those ways. And it's really hard to have a Bible so destabilized for the community.
Well, and I think that's one of the reasons why we stick with King James Version, is because that was the version Joseph Smith used. And so, because I remember last time you said, especially on the little minor changes that Joseph Smith made, that if we just updated the version of the Bible to a modern translation, a lot of those just disappear, those problems disappear.
And I think that's one of the things readers said in the first edition of my translation. Why didn't you use the Joseph Smith translation? And I think a lot of people don't know that so much of the Joseph Smith translation is about the KJV, and a modern translation, because it renders it differently, doesn't have those same issues. So you really can't engage it. You can't put it in the footnotes even. Yeah.
Well, and it's funny because as we look, there's the article of faith. We believe the Bible is the Word of God as far as it is translated correctly. And when we get a correct translation, it's like we almost rebel against it.
Yeah. That's true. It's hard for us to really, I think, say that Bible translators don't have motive. That's a hard thing. I've heard from a number of audiences that there's a perception that Bible translators are shifty people who have done kind of damage or treated the Bible without respect. But Bible translators are very careful. They're very skilled. And with the exception of a very small class of Bibles, these main Bibles, NIV, NRSV, ESV, these are excellent translations, and readers would do well to engage them.
Yeah. I think my listeners know that. Well, I had an interesting conversation yesterday with Kyle Bashirs. He's a Baptist pastor in Alabama. He's here in Utah. Actually was at BYU on an interfaith thing. And it was funny because we were talking about translations of the Bible, and I asked him what he used, and I think he said ESV, mentioned a couple different ones, but he said that he recently defended the King James Version against people like me that think, just get rid of it. It's like a Model T Ford. It's a cool, if you want to drive in a parade with a Model T, that would be great, but I don't want to drive to work in that thing every day. And that to me, that's how the King James Version is. And I would love for us to update our Bibles. We do this in other languages, but in English, it's like we're married to the King James Version. And can you talk about that issue? Because Joseph Smith used the King James, is that why we're stuck with it? Will we ever be able to, use a NRSV or ESV or some of these other Bibles?
Yeah, it's a complicated story for me. So I can only really give you my perspective. I'm not sure what the we, could do. That we'll see, what the future holds. But from a person like me's perspective, I encounter a lot of people who read the Bible. I speak to groups and give feedback. And what we've developed in the church, in my opinion, is an elite readership. And these are typically white males who have been through the seminary program. They potentially have been to BYU, and they can decode the KJV. They can read it well. They understand it pretty well. And then the loss in the next generation is enormous. And every generation we go earlier, so your seminary students today, only a few of those will graduate from seminary being able to read the KJV. And so to me, I cannot understand why we would kind of keep a text that we simply can't understand when there's an understandable version. It's kind of like trying to do mathematics in Latin. You're like, well, people know how to do math, but we're going to do ours in Latin. And I don't doubt that a lot of people have learned to decode this text. I have my doubts on whether we do it all well, but we at least do it. But I think we've learned, and we've heard other people talk about it. But
is it because our leadership is so old? I mean, I hate to go ageist like that, but like they grew up with it, they understand it. Why don't the younger generation?
In a sense, it's maybe prolonged exposure to it. Maybe it's comfort. They taught it, and on their missions, they read it, and the people on the other side also read it. And that's not happening anymore. So if our missionaries read the King James, it is very rare that someone on the other side will say, oh, that's also the Bible I read. So they'll be reading the NIV or the NRSV or something, and we'll be reading this older translation. So we're like Shakespearean performers.
Right.
We're out there reading this Bible in a way that's hard for them to understand. And that loss is inexplicable because as a Greek scholar, that's not the way it's written. It is not that elegant. In fact, at times it's pretty rough. It's not the greatest Greek. And so we kind of have a manufactured view of these people who spoke in these really great sentences and had these perfect kind of ways of formulating their thoughts. And the New Testament has a kind of rawness, a kind of abrasiveness to its diction. It's not that well said. And then there are other times when it is, and that stands out if you read it in Greek or something else, that they're trying to capture the way these folks really sounded. And that's hard. Now everybody kind of thinks, in these and thous. And
well, we have to pray that way.
Oh, right. That's fair. But really, no one talks like that in the New Testament. And so that's hard to... Now I translate back into King James Version in my Sunday services so I can kind of understand how people are talking about it.
Yeah. I talked to Patrick Mason, and one of the things that he said, our church is still an adolescent, especially in relation to, say, the Catholic Church, which is 2,000 years old, and we're 200 years old. We're 10 years old versus... And so... is our church not mature enough to go into some of these other, to allow ourselves to study other translations of the Bible, for example? Is that a good way to think of it?
I suspect it's probably more mundane than that, and I suspect it's probably copyright. I suspect owning the copyright of one of these translations is a big deal, and it's going to cost a lot of money, and it would be hard to also create a committee today to say we'll translate it, because Latter-day Saints would immediately think that the Quorum of the 12 or a president of the church would be at the head of that, like Joseph Smith was. And so it creates a really kind of confusing space. Who would lead that? And there are gifted translators that could do the old and new.
You're talking about an actual LDS translation?
Yeah, if we were to.
Because what about in other countries? It seems like we just use whatever Bible off the shelf. Right?
Through the purchase of copyright. So,
oh, we do?
Yeah,
we like have an LES version of the German RSV or whatever. I mean, is that essentially?
We do indeed. At least as far as I understand it. I'm not an expert, but I do know that things like the Reina Valera and others are a purchased copyright. And so you have to also now navigate a space that a faith community might own that. And now you have to say, can we use that alongside you? And so Reina Valera is an older copyright. It's one that's been around for a while, but was available. I believe it's continued to be updated, and we use it kind of several generations ago, but could be wrong about that. I'm, again, not an expert.
Well, you've got a good version we could do. I'm sure you'd be willing to sell that to the church, right?
Sure. Copyright's mine. Yeah, no, I guess I want Jesus to be alive. Yeah. I mean, I really want these people to be alive. And I'm not sure the KJV is living anymore. I feel like it's dead, and I know that some people will, criticize that and say, "Oh, it's so elegant," and it's a Bible of.
But they're a bunch of old people. They're not young people saying that, right?
Well, maybe. I'm not going to offend all the listeners out there, but my sense is that the Bible is interesting, very interesting text, and to read it through the words of Shakespeare maybe isn't the best experience that we can have with it.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because, I mean, I've been to Shakespeare and understand half the words they're saying. I mean, I know it's English.
You're right.
But I'm like, this doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, so if they weren't performing, it would be really hard.
Well, even when they're performing, it's hard.
Right. Imagine going to Sunday school now and taking away the entire performance and you only have the Shakespeare dialogue.
Right.
It's hard. It's really hard. Yeah. I will sometimes in my Sunday school check the English of the KJV in the Greek so I know what it says. Because the English is still somewhat foreign to me the way it works.
Oh, wow.
It's hard.
Well, it would be nice if we all learned Greek, I guess, right?
Well, yeah, there's plenty of room in classics at BYU. You can enroll. We would love to have you. And we're a wonderful bunch. I think people would like that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Mark. Mark, most scholars believe, was the first gospel written, and I think almost all scholars agree that it was the most poor grammar of any of the gospels. It's the shortest. It doesn't have a resurrection story. It doesn't have a birth story. Tell us more about the Gospel of Mark.
Yeah, there's some really, really great work being done on Gospel of Mark today that's new, it's exciting. And one of them that I find really engaged in is a work by a fellow named Larson, who has argued that Mark might even be a kind of notes, a kind of pre-writing or outline before we get to the final text that Matthew and Luke write. And one of the things that a scholar sees that is very clear that Matthew and Luke are going to quote Mark, but they fix him. And it's almost impossible to imagine the other way around. It's why we think Mark's earlier. So Mark will say it in his inelegant way, and Matthew quotes him, but he fixes all the ambiguities. For example, a really great one in Mark says, John was not worthy to bend down. And it's like, that doesn't make a lot of sense. You want him to say he's not worthy to bend down and untie Jesus' sandals, but Mark's kind of inelegance is that he wasn't worthy to bend over. And okay.
Is that because he couldn't speak Greek well, possibly?
It's possible. It's possible that the notes theory works as well, that this was just quickly writing out a story. And so Matthew comes along and gives us the version we know. He's not worthy to bend down and untie the Savior's shoes. And I think Mark's rawness catches a lot of my students. We read Mark a couple semesters ago, and about a third of the way through, somebody will say, almost every sentence begins with and it's like this run.
And it came to pass.
Yeah, and then immediately. And everything happens so fast in Mark. He ties everything together with these conjunctions. And immediately he did this. And then he went here, and then he went here, and then he went here. And it's like for Mark, there's no situational narrative. It's not about Capernaum. It's about this running dialogue to get to the Jesus event. And I see that as a kind of rawness, a kind of Maybe he didn't know the story well, and indeed maybe notes, if you will, kind of tell it. Another theory that's out there that's very interesting is that Mark is an attempt at Roman literature. It's this early kind of, we have the Jesus story. What would it look like as a Roman novel, if you will, or a Roman story that other people are telling? And so interesting work being done. But yeah, it's the earliest. I'm convinced that that's a fair assessment.
And I mean, to compare it to the Book of Mormon, a lot of Mark Twain famously said the Book of Mormon was chloroform in print. There were a lot of grammar errors. I mean, is Mark kind of the same way, like kind of a young farm boy who wrote this that wasn't Shakespeare?
Yeah. I mean, clearly Mark isn't as gifted a writer as, say, Luke or Paul in Romans. Paul's very eloquent in Romans. Luke has excellent, grammar and style and a broad vocabulary, and Mark has this very narrow vocabulary. So all of these things to me kind of get to an author that's either in a hurry or is maybe telling it extemporaneously and somebody's writing it down. But it's different than Matthew. Matthew's intentional. He invokes Genesis 1:1 in Matthew 1:1. He starts with a plan. Luke starts with a plan. They're correcting, adding, filling in. So yes, they view Mark as deficient as well.
And I want to talk about the ending because the original ending of Mark was just...
And they were afraid.
They left. So the stone was rolled away.
Yeah.
The women didn't know where Jesus was, and they were just afraid. They left afraid. So even in Mark, we don't even know what happened to Jesus. We don't know that he's resurrected. He's just gone.
He's gone, yeah.
And we don't know why he's gone. Why have that ending? I've heard that other people were like so unsatisfied with it. That's why they added the long ending of Mark. But the original ending, historically, why would that make sense?
It depends on if we think that the story is a biography of Jesus. And so a biography of Jesus needs to grapple with why the tomb's empty. But if Mark is a telling of what people felt, and he has a lot of emotion in his story, he might be capturing that early generations. The empty tomb scared us. Like that fear might characterize the first decades of the movement. And it's hard to say, here we're getting into an author's mind and we're conjecturing what he's feeling. But I'm convinced with what we have today, we could fairly confidently say Mark ended with the women leaving afraid. And there were no visits. There's no tangible resurrection. There were none of that story. That's not the same as those stories weren't out there. But it is to say that some way he thought the pinnacle moment of the Jesus story was we were afraid. And maybe that's how they felt around him. Maybe that's what was in their hearts, etc. So there's some very valid reasons to end that way.
Would this have been, let's see, I'm trying to remember, the destruction of Jerusalem was around 50 AD, if I remember right?
You're probably thinking 70, around 70.
70. So was Mark written before the destruction?
It's tricky, but a lot of scholars do place it in that generation right before.
And so Jesus, our Messiah, is gone. He's not here. I mean, this is what the people were thinking. There were no resurrection stories yet. I mean, we've got the famous story, Paul on the road to Emmaus, right? But Matthew and Luke haven't been written yet. And so I don't want to say, did they embellish a resurrection story, or, how do we explain the differences there?
There's another kind of challenge with resurrection that I see if we're talking about these early views of it. It's not evidently clear that if Jesus resurrects, it has anything to do with you. He said all along, if we're reading chapter 9, on the third day I'll rise, and he's tried to telegraph to his disciples.
Chapter 9 of Mark?
Yeah, chapter 9 of Mark. He's tried to telegraph to these disciples, I'm going to die and rise again. Well, that's wonderful. He rises again. But what does that mean for you and I?
Are we going to live again?
Yeah, and I think it takes Christians a generation or more to ask that very question. What does the raising the empty tomb mean for me in ways that you see already Paul exploring? Paul wants to be conformed to the image of Jesus, and he starts to hope for a better body, a body that's not quite as broken as his. He wrestles with his own kind of personal mortality. And you watch Christians doing this very thing. What will the empty tomb come to mean? Is it victory? And whose victory? Is it Jesus's victory, or is it a Roman/opponents of Jesus victory? And so I think it's a powerful ending, a really powerful one that gets supplanted by these louder voices. He was standing in the open tomb. He talked to people, and other things that characterize almost every Easter story about him.
Well, because Mary Magdalene is the one that I know she's been called the apostle of the apostles.
Right, or apostle to the apostles.
Yeah. And so the ending in Mark is very different than the story of Mary. Touch me not, because she was supposedly going to hug him or something, or at least that's what it sounds like in the Greek, if I understand that right. Am I telling that right?
Yeah, the phrase is in Gospel of John, me mu aptu, don't hold on to me, don't kind of tangibly grab me. And so it's not an electric touch issue. It's not a like, bam, I touched you and I'm incinerated. So Jesus says, don't touch me, I don't want to incinerate you. It's apparent that she's probably clasped him, grabbed him in a sense of an embrace or some type of thing. And he's subtly probably saying, I won't stay here even if you hold me, some type of thing like that.
Like, let go of me?
Yeah, I'm going to heaven in either way. And I think there's another kind of embarrassment that we don't often talk about in the gospel stories. And I mean this an embarrassment for them, not for us. I want to be clear for everyone out there. But the gospels all agree that the disciples weren't the primary people at the tomb, that even the ones that went and ventured there left without a visitation. And so the early church is grappling with, why didn't his closest disciples see it? They're not there. And then you mentioned, Mary Magdalene becomes the apostle to the disciples. She tells them, and they are the ones who are there mourning him. And so fear is an interesting thing to insert in that space. Maybe it captures what most people were feeling about the tomb.
Well, I mean, to me, fear is an obvious thing, because Jesus is killed because he's a criminal or a traitor or, treason, essentially. Isn't that why he was killed? Because he was trying to take over or claim to be a king of Rome, and you just don't do that in the Roman Empire, right?
Sure, and it's a particularly Johannine way to see it, that it's about kingship and rule and whatnot, and power, and yeah, that's...
Do the other Gospels not look at it the same way?
I don't think the other Gospels are as concerned with causation, like what would be the trial charge, like if we were to find a document and had, this is the charge of Jesus, and it would say it on it. I think there's varying interests in what led to his death. If it's necessary and it's part of the plan and God warranted and wanted this thing, then no human causation was anything but helpful to that plan. And so it creates really deep theological questions. Are you helping God's plan by hurting Jesus? And so I think authors are willing enough to say, I'm going to leave the issue of causation on the table, and other people can sort that out.
Interesting. Because you had said that both Matthew and Luke essentially corrected Mark, added a resurrection story in both cases added a birth story.
Yep, they do, yeah.
Why does Mark not have a birth story and Matthew and Luke do?
I wonder, for particularly Mark, if he thought it really didn't matter who you were born from as much as what you were. There's that question, if Matthew is, Matthew tells the genealogy first. He, page 1, here are all his ancestors. And so you'll see this channel just a little bit in McConkie and Talmage, who will see him as the heir to the messiahship, if you will. He's the anointed, the person that has to really do this. And that's a great thing. It grapples with the volition of Jesus. If he's anointed and doesn't want to, that's a challenging space. And I think Mark is saying he was the Messiah as evidenced through the miracles. That's a really Markan way to say it. And I think that would be his stronger case. If he intentionally wrote this thing with a kind of plan, if it's not just notes, that's what I would say.
Interesting. I had an interview recently with Trevin Hatch. You know Trevin?
Yeah, Trevin's wonderful.
So Trevin's interesting in that he is a Jewish studies scholar and made a, at least to me, surprising claim. And actually, I will just mention, I've mentioned this to a couple of evangelical pastors, and they vehemently disagree with Trevin.
Sure.
That, well, two things. Number one, Jesus was actually friends with the Pharisees, not enemies. And number two, that the Gospel of John is actually kind of anti-Semitic. What do you think of that?
And you feel that people were kind of vehemently opposed to that view?
I know two, I won't name them, but I know two that I've talked to about this, and they were like, oh, that's an old 80s argument. That's silly. That's not true. The anti-Semitism specifically.
Interesting. Yeah. I think there's something to it. I think it has some validity. John always speaks about Jewish people in a third person, as though that Jesus himself or his disciples or the writer himself wasn't Jewish. And that's peculiar to set, the Jews, but everybody in the story.
Jesus was Jewish.
Yeah. And so I imagine.
Or was Jesus Christian?
Well, yeah, that's a fair debate. And I would imagine that Trevin is channeling some of that asking that, and possibly that Acts 15 notice that Pharisees weighed in on the Jerusalem Council. They brought at least their own perspective to that. And Gamaliel, the debate about Christians, should we leave them alone? I mean, there's a lot of evidence that Jews are debating, the Christian movement. And so, yeah, I can see John carving out a claim in that by saying the Jews, those other folks, not us, and whatnot. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't want to enter debate and become in any way controversial, but yeah.
Oh, come on.
At least not on that point. I don't have as much at stake, but yeah, it's very clear that some ways John has spoken about Jewish people are unfortunate at the minimum.
Okay. I think we talked a little bit about this last time, but do you see John as kind of a Gnostic gospel?
I don't. In a sense of what is he doing? I think John is a journey story more than anything, and I'm familiar with the various divisions that people have, but I think he's the man from heaven, and I think what John starts with, in a way that if I were to explain it back to someone, I think that what he's looking at is Genesis in Hebrew or Aramaic, and he's saying that when God's mouth opens, a thing comes out called the Memra, and that's the Word of God. And I think by saying that Jesus is the Logos of God, I think he's saying that Jesus is the embodiment of God's Word himself. And so I think it's a journey story of how the Word became among us and how we interacted with God's own Word. And so it has some interesting dynamics. Like, does that Word, will it conquer? Will it create new things? It does. It creates a community. It creates love, which might be one of the reasons that John grapples with. There's really only one commandment, and that is to love one another. And then an almost ironic ending that way. You can't kill the Word of God. No matter how fast you nail it to a stake, he's not going to die. And so John's
the
different.
Energizer bunny.
Yeah, if you will. He's powerful beyond life. And so I'm not sure I would say there's a lot of Gnostic in that, but more the journey of a soul, of God's soul, if you will, or the Word of God.
Okay. I'm trying to decide here. What other... You said you added additional footnotes. You added a new introduction. Can you tell us a little bit more of those details?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for everybody out there that's considering, should I buy the new one or
just buy it? Don't even think about it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, go ahead and buy the new one. But I I corrected it. I received a lot of feedback from the first one, and people helped me see, maybe you could have worded this a little different. So there are about a dozen, if I remember correctly, changes in the actual text.
Okay.
And that was super comforting to me. Such a large book, you'd
have to be a Greek scholar to do that, though, right?
Sure, that's fair. And so you're hopeful that you haven't made any laughable mistakes, any howlers, if you will. And then there's this issue of the footnotes, and I got a chance.
Which I love, by the way.
Oh, thanks. I honestly wish there was a chance to do more, and some of the things I consider for future. Is there a place to maybe put it online, all of the other kind of notes that I have assembled and things like that? But what it really changed is, and this is me being out on a limb as much as I want to be, is trying to rewrite the introduction in a way for why. Why do you want this? And to me, I think that if you were asking me what I thought we were facing as a community, what obstacles, I think we have become obsessed with the historicalness of a text. And we'll have to insist on things like Job was a real person. And we'll have to insist on all these kind of things being historical texts. That's fine. I don't know if there was a Job or not. I'm not going out on that limb. But one of the things that the Bible isn't, it's not a history. No portion of the Bible is trying to really tell the full history. These are all motivated stories. And one of the things I think we could re-envision and rethink about is the Bible, okay, it's historical or not, it's still valuable. And to confine a book to say it has to be historical and then its meaning derives from that, I think limits it incredibly. I think that's happening with the Book of Mormon, this kind of obsession with, did it happen here in Mesoamerica or Ohio or wherever at?
Melee.
Yeah, and I don't know. I'm not here to weigh in on that. But we start with that, and then the Book of Mormon's message becomes subordinate to that, and then happens to the New Testament. We fight over where the empty tomb is, like where is this actual thing? Regardless of where it happened, it was meaningful for those authors. And so I tried to help people realize that engaging with the text on a personal level is the greatest thing this text can offer. It can reconstruct history for some parts, maybe. It can tell us that Gallio was, he was governor of Corinth. Right, it confirms that. But the value of the New Testament is for you to get mad at it, and you to get happy with it, and you to realize, and I say this with utmost respect, Paul is not a nice person. He says really mean things to people. And he gets overly sorry. And we miss that because we're reading it in Shakespeare and we're like, I didn't realize that was anger he was channeling. And he gets to these moments and he's kind of like this kind of growing firestorm. And then he'll just say something borderline inappropriate. And then he'll call it back in. And it's okay. I think it's okay for a modern reader to read Paul and say, man, he'd be hard to work with, or he would be this way. And to realize there's a real person back there, regardless of historical order of his letters. And I don't necessarily like him, or I do like him. And we are losing that narrative. If history matters first, I think we've subordinated our faith to history and not what really matters. So I tried to capture some of that in the intro to say, come back with me, enter the New Testament, read it in a way that your teenager can understand, and ask, does this have stories for us that matter? And so I hope it's better. I hope the intro is stronger and had good feedback so far.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Thomas Wayment. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about a passage by the Apostle Paul that Tom says Joseph changed the meaning.
Paul is grappling with the reality that he doesn't enjoy being good in a very ground-based level. And he talks about, I know what's right, I know what's good. He said, but the desire to do that, I have not inside me. It doesn't exist here. And then he says the most stunning thing, I like to do bad. And Joseph will change that exactly opposite.
Thanks for listening to Gospel Tangents. If you'd like to support me, please subscribe at gospeltangents.com or on patreon.com/gospeltangents, or you can watch entire videos at youtube.com/gospeltangents. I really can't do this without your support. I'd love to do it full time, and I need a lot more people that are willing to help me out. So I'd really appreciate that. So thanks again for listening, and don't forget to check out some of our other videos.